A mother and her young daughter went on a solo camping trip into the desert and never came back. For over 11 years, they were simply gone or vanished without a trace. But then, one day, her son stumbled upon their abandoned truck, hidden deep within the desert sands. A discovery that would change everything and finally reveal the shocking truth about what really happened to them. The summer sky over Arizona was a vast, unyielding canvas of brilliance and blues, punctuated by the promise of endless horizons and secrets whispered by the wind. On a warm, bright weekend, Maya Miller, a gentle yet determined woman with eyes that reflected both hope and hidden burdens, set out with her 8-year-old daughter, Kelsey, to experience the raw beauty of the desert. For Maya, this camping trip was meant to be a brief escape from the daily struggles of city life, a chance to forge cherished memories with her beloved child amid the rugged splendor of the barren landscape. Little did anyone know that this journey, filled with laughter and quiet wonder, would mark the last time they were ever seen. Maya had meticulously planned the adventure, packing a well-worn leather backpack filled with essentials, a faded quilt that had once served as a comforting heirloom, and a small collection of Kelsey's favorite storybooks and trinkets. As they drove across winding desert roads in their aging sedan, the landscape shifted dramatically from bustling suburbs to an endless sea of sun-baked red rocks, sparse vegetation, and the haunting melodies of the wind as it carried dust over vast, empty plains. Kelsey, with her curious eyes and boundless energy, pressed her forehead against the car window, marveling at the sight of rugged canyons and distant mountains that glowed in the late afternoon light. By the time they set up camp at a remote clearing deep in the heart of the desert, dusk had already begun to soften the edges of the day. Maya and Kelsey worked together to pitch a small tent beneath a sprawl of twisted juniper trees. The setting was almost surreal, a place where the earthly and the timeless converged beneath the celestial dome of sparkling stars. They shared a simple meal of sandwiches and fruit, laughing over silly stories and making plans for the morrow's exploration. Kelsey's bright laughter melded with the quiet hum of the desert, as if even the wind paused to listen. As night fell, an almost magical silence enveloped the campsite. The desert, bathed in the cool glow of a full moon, seemed to hold its breath. Maya tucked Kelsey into her sleeping bag, reading softly from a cherished storybook by the flickering light of a camp lantern. The peaceful moments, however, belied an undercurrent of mystery. Their only company that night was the occasional distant howl of a coyote and the whisper of shifting sands outside their small tent. In the early hours of the morning, without warning, the calm was shattered. A sudden, unexplained disturbance, unseen and unheard by anyone except in the restless dreams of a child, cut through the darkness. Kelsey awoke in terror, her small body trembling as the remnants of a nightmare clung to her like dew. In the dim light, Maya found her daughter in tears, murmuring about shadows that danced near the tent's opening and a mysterious presence that had brushed against her in the dark. Yet, when Maya rose to investigate, every inch of the campsite was as it had been, undisturbed, with no sign of intrusion or struggle. No footprints marred the soft desert sand, and no faint echo of voices or rustlings hinted at any human presence. By dawn, when the desert's first light began to dispel the night's illusions, the silence was more profound than ever. Maya attempted to comfort Kelsey, attributing the events to an overactive imagination stirred by the vast, eerie solitude of the wilderness. They gathered their modest belongings as promised, intending to ride out the brief isolation before returning to civilization. Yet, as the day wore on, a creeping unease settled over Maya. The usual hum of the road, the familiar shapes of passing vehicles, and even the small chatter from the local towns were conspicuously absent in every harbinger of their journey home. Hours turned to an agonizing uncertainty. When they failed to reappear at the designated meeting point, phone calls went unanswered and text messages remained unsent. By late afternoon, panic gripped the hearts of those waiting for them. Maya's husband, John Miller, who had anxiously monitored their progress from home, tried repeatedly to contact them, but his calls dissolved into static over the barren cell towers scattered across the desert. Fearing the worst, he alerted the authorities. Within hours, the police and local search teams mobilized, combing the arid expanse on rugged four-wheel drives, and even dispatching aerial units over the vast desert. Dozens of volunteers joined the search, trekking through blistering heat and unforgiving sand to find any trace of Maya and little Kelsey. Yet, despite their frantic efforts across hundreds of miles of desolate terrain, there was no sign that the two had ever left the remote campsite. No footprints, no abandoned belongings, nothing to indicate they had ever been there at all. The case, which had ignited hope for a miraculous reunion, soon began to take on an unbearable chill. Rumors swirled, and investigators started entertaining the possibility of foul play, or even that Maya and Kelsey had deliberately vanished. In the end, after days turned into a week with no breakthrough, the search gradually lost momentum. The case was officially closed, with authorities leaning toward theories of an unfortunate accident, a sudden attack in the vast expanses of the desert, or perhaps a voluntary escape from an insurmountable personal crisis. The very notion that a mother and her young daughter would simply vanish without a trace left a lasting scar on the community. Yet, for John Miller and for those who had once witnessed the smiling faces of Maya and Kelsey, the unanswered questions only multiplied. The desert had swallowed them whole, a haunting void that defied all logic and reason. And somewhere, in that unforgiving land of scorching sun, swirling sand, and endless silence, the truth lay buried, waiting to be uncovered many years later by someone driven by a need to reconcile guilt, memory, and the enduring search for answers. In the weeks following the vanishing of Maya and Kelsey, the once close-knit Miller family began to unravel like a fragile thread pulled too tight. Back in the city, the terror of a loved one disappearing without a trace had a profound, wrenching impact on everyone. But none were as deeply affected as Jake Miller, the elder son. At just 14 years old, Jake was forced to confront a heavy burden of guilt and self-recrimination. In the aftermath of that final camping trip in the remote Arizona desert, when his mother and little sister vanished into the unforgiving sands, Jake became convinced that he somehow had been responsible for their disappearance. His thoughts echoed relentlessly through long, haunted nights. Had I not insisted on staying behind, or had I failed to protect them when we last gathered around the campfire? These questions tormented him, as if every moment of carefree camaraderie should have somehow prepared him for the darkness that followed. John Miller, the father, spiraled into a state of deep depression. A man once defined by his unwavering work ethic and gentle humor, he became a shadow of his former self. The weight of the investigation, the endless search efforts, and the uncertainty of whether his wife and daughter were alive cast him into a relentless melancholia. Every phone call that went unanswered and every fruitless report from a search team deepened his anguish. In his silence, he absorbed the blame silently too, believing that his inability to protect his family, his failure to detect or even avert the tragedy in the desert, was a personal failing as a husband and father. The atmosphere at home grew stifling. Jake, overwhelmed by guilt, withdrew into himself. He spent endless hours poring over old photographs and maps of that fateful weekend, trying to recreate every detail to pinpoint where he might have made a different choice. The once lively household dinners turned into quiet meals punctuated by awkward silences. His father's subdued sorrow and the strained interactions within the family created an environment where even trivial disagreements erupted into painful disputes. In the absence of Maya's warmth and Kelsey's bright laughter, every conversation was haunted by memories and by the unspoken accusations that reverberated through the empty rooms. At school, Jake's classmates, with their youthful cruelty and insensitivity, began taunting him with whispers of the boy who lost his family and did you see the man who wasn't there? The children's taunts, primitive and cruel, only compounded Jake's internal torment. Every jeer and mocking joke confirmed his own belief that he should have been there to protect his family. He began to see himself as the catalyst for their disappearance, a constant reminder of a mistake that he could neither rectify nor forget. In the months that followed, and as the search efforts gradually lost momentum, the official narrative began to shift. Despite the exhaustive efforts of law enforcement and the impassioned pleas of desperate family members, after nearly a year of relentless searching across arid deserts and barren landscapes, authorities had no choice but to classify Maya and Kelsey as missing. This official pronouncement, delivered in a quiet press conference in a sterile police office, felt to the Millers not as the closure they had hoped for, but as a final capitulation to despair. For John, the announcement was an admission not only that his wife and daughter were gone, but that the world had turned a blind eye to the horror that had befallen his family. For Jake, it solidified the internal narrative that their disappearance was an irreversible, inexplicable loss. A loss for which he now bore the weight of personal guilt. In the living room of their once warm, bustling home, the silence was oppressive. Old family photos stared back from the walls, and the echoes of laughter were replaced by the quiet drip of a leaky faucet. Jake often sat beneath the faded mural of happier times, revisiting memories of camping trips, warm summer picnics, and mother-daughter bonding that seemed so distant now. Each memory was tinged with the anguish of what was lost, and it deepened his resolve to discover a truth that might someday explain the inexplicable disappearance. The unyielding desert, with its silent expanses and shifting sands, loomed as a metaphor for the vast unknown he was desperate to explore. A promise that someday, perhaps, he would unearth the answers his heart craved. As the year passed, outside voices in the community began to grow tired of the unresolved case. The flashing headlines and whispered discussions at local diners eventually faded into obscurity, leaving the Miller family grappling with an endless void of uncertainty amidst their fractured relationships. Yet, in every quiet, lonely moment, Jake could not shake the feeling that there was something beneath the surface, a hidden secret locked in the barren sands of that desert, awaiting his discovery. Then, unexpectedly, a mysterious letter arrived at Jake's door one rainy afternoon. A plain envelope with no return address. Inside, a single handwritten note read, "The desert remembers. You must go." Tucked beneath the note was a faded child's drawing. A crude, colorful sketch unmistakably drawn by Kelsey. The image of a sun, a wild tumble of cacti, and, almost imperceptibly, a shape resembling a battered truck in the distance, ignited a spark in Jake's heart. That simple drawing, imbued with the innocence of a child, was the final piece of the puzzle Jake had been searching for all these years. It was a silent summons from the past, urging him to return to the desert and confront the mystery head-on. A mystery that had haunted him since that fateful weekend and fractured his life in ways he had never imagined. For 11 long years, Jake Miller lived in both the shadow and the silence of a desert mystery that refused to yield its secrets. The absence of his mother Maya and younger sister Kelsey became not only a source of deep personal loss, but also an all-consuming puzzle, a riddle that haunted every heartbeat and every thought. In the years after that fateful camping trip, when search parties scoured hundreds of miles of barren land with no trace of the family, hope dwindled for most. But Jake, now a man whose heart still bore the raw imprint of that unresolved disappearance, could not let go. The unanswered questions had taken root in his soul, growing as persistent as the desert wind that once whispered across the same unforgiving sands. Jake spent long nights in his modest apartment poring over satellite images, official search reports, and old news clippings. Every article about the case, every update from police archives, became a fragment of a sprawling mosaic that he hoped would someday reveal the truth. The case files, once sealed away in government offices, were now available to him through public records. He studied maps with a meticulous obsession, tracing the roads and routes where his mother and sister had apparently vanished. In his worn study, a single lamp illuminated a cluttered desk covered in faded documents and scribbled annotations. Jake's walls were adorned with printed maps, photographs of the endless desert, and newspaper clippings featuring headlines that had once shocked his family and town alike. Mother and child vanish in Arizona. Desert mystery deepens in abandoned campsite. No trace remains. Family lost to the sands. Each night, as he opened a dusty file or carefully reread a police report, a whirlwind of emotions churned within him. Guilt, grief, and a dreamlike hope that the key to the mystery was hidden in those monotonous records. The voice of a 14-year-old boy that had once echoed with frantic questions had matured into an unyielding determination that drove him to seek every lost piece of his family's past. At times, he blamed himself in hushed moments before his empty desk. "I should have been there. I should have done something," he would murmur as tears welled in his eyes, remembering how he sat helplessly, unable to prevent that unimaginable disappearance. Years passed, and while the world outside moved on, the case remained an open wound in his heart. Friends and acquaintances eventually began referring to the incident as a long-closed chapter, urging him to let go. Yet deep inside, Jake knew that the mystery was not over. Further research led him to suspect that the disappearance was not a random accident or a voluntary escape, as some officials had insinuated. Hidden in the margins of old search maps and cryptic reports, there was a suggestion, a rumor perhaps, that an unconventional clue had always been whispered among those involved. These seeds of doubt, watered by his relentless curiosity, took root over the years. Then, on one rainy afternoon that mirrored the melancholic tone of his memories, Jake found an unexpected letter in his mailbox. The envelope was plain, with no return address, its heavy paper markedly out of place amid the everyday bills and flyers. With trembling hands, he broke the fragile seal and unfolded the note inside. There, written in a looping, childlike hand, were the words, "The desert remembers. You must go." Beneath that cryptic message lay a faded, fragile drawing, a work of art that radiated the innocence of childhood. The drawing depicted a bright, beaming sun, a scattering of cacti and swirling sand, and subtly drawn in the background, a shape resembling a battered truck partially swallowed by the dunes. In that moment, every long silent question pulsed to life in Jake's mind. The drawing, unmistakably drawn by a young hand, stirred memories of Kelsey's artwork from long ago. It rekindled the painful sorrow of her laughter suddenly extinguished during that ill-fated camping trip and hinted at an enigmatic truth hidden deep in the desert's heart. Jake's mind raced. The letter arrived exactly at the moment when he had doubts about whether his decades-long research had been worth it. Was this message a sign? A final invitation from the past demanding that he confront what he had once been too young to understand? The note was brief and mysterious, yet it felt like a summons from the very secrets of the desert itself. The desert remembers. Those few words seemed to echo with voices from the past, a message that his mother's fate was intertwined with something larger than anyone had ever imagined. Conviction began to crystallize in him. Every sleepless night, every painful review of old records, had led up to this unequivocal moment of clarity. The letter was not merely a random act. It was as if the desert, the ancient witness to so many secrets, had decided it was time for the truth to surface. Jake realized that he could no longer sit idly by while the unanswered mysteries drove him further into despair. With the drawing in one hand and the enigmatic note in the other, he resolved to embark on an expedition to the region hinted at by the sketch. He began planning the journey with a measured blend of trepidation and resolve. The thought of re-entering the unforgiving desert stirred in him both fear and anticipation. He reviewed the old satellite maps once more, focusing on remote areas and abandoned roads where nothing had ever been found. That battered truck sketched in the drawing, obscured by time and nature, became a focal point of his investigation, a relic that perhaps held the long-lost confession of his mother. Jake's heart pounded with the realization that everything he had lived with, the unhealed wounds, the guilt, the scattered fragments of memory, might finally converge into a singular, unequivocal truth waiting beneath the barren sands. Thus, armed with determination that years of silence had only sharpened, Jake began to gather supplies, research local desert routes, and quietly arrange for the necessary permits. In every logistical detail, he prepared to recreate the conditions of that last fateful camping trip. The doubt and pain that had shadowed his days were slowly replaced by a steely resolve. The letter had shattered the monotony of his long grieving and forced him out of his isolation. It was time to return to the land that had swallowed his family whole and to unearth the secrets buried in its scorching depths. With the cryptic letter and faded drawing clutched tightly in his hand, Jake set out on a journey into the very heart of the Arizona desert, a land of molten gold and crimson dunes that seemed to hold secrets older than time itself. The day had been blisteringly hot, the sky a relentless canopy of brilliant blue overhead as he drove his battered four-wheel drive into the remote region marked on the satellite images. Every mile carried him deeper into a wilderness where the heat shimmered above the sand, and the horizon was reduced to a mirage. Yet beneath the oppressive glare and swirling winds, Jake felt a magnetic pull, a call from the past urging him to unearth the hidden truth of his family's long-forgotten fate. The route was treacherous and unmarked in many areas, a mere collection of sandy tracks and broken gravel roads that disappeared into the ever-changing dunes. Jake's vehicle rattled over loose rock and thin layers of salt that crusted on the surface, a constant reminder of the relentless forces that shaped the landscape. He paused at intervals to study the faded contours on his weathered map and compare them with the satellite images on his phone, searching for landmarks that might illuminate the cryptic instructions suggested by the child's drawing. Every so often, he would catch a fleeting glimpse of something unusual on the horizon, a rusted silhouette partially buried in sun-bleached sand, which remained just out of reach before vanishing under a shifting dune. After several long hours of solitary travel and restless determination, Jake finally reached an isolated area that perfectly matched the description in the drawing. His pulse quickened as he pulled over beside a vast expanse of undulating sand, where the natural features revealed traces of forgotten man-made structures. In the near distance, barely visible beneath layers of dust and sun-bleached grit, was a decrepit truck, its once proud metal frame now corroded and partially entombed by the relentless desert. The truck lay quietly amid the silence, as if it had been deliberately abandoned long ago. Its faded paint peeled away in brittle sheets, and its rusted contours caught the light in odd, haunting glints. With cautious excitement, Jake switched off the engine and stepped out into the shimmering heat. The dry wind kicked up small eddies of sand around his boots as he walked toward the truck. Every step was accompanied by the crunch of gravel and the whisper of wind through open canyons, and his eyes scanned the landscape for any additional clues that might affirm the significance of this relic. There was a strangely melancholic beauty to the truck's decay, a frozen testament to a life and story long buried beneath the desert's endless memory. Circling the vehicle, Jake noted that it was parked off a nearly invisible strip of gravel that suggested it had been driven there long ago and then left to succumb to the elements. The door, hanging crooked on rusted hinges, was slightly ajar as though someone had hurriedly exited and never returned. Though apprehensive, Jake felt compelled to inch closer. The interior of the truck beckoned with the residue of a past that was both mysterious and sorrowful. With trembling hands, he pushed open the door wider and climbed into the truck's cab. The air inside was heavy with the sense of decay, old oil, and desert dust. Shafts of light pierced through cracked windows, illuminating scattered debris. A tangle of torn fabric, faded papers, and remnants of what might once have been personal mementos. Amid the detritus, his eyes were drawn to a small, leather-bound notebook lying atop the cracked dashboard. Next to it, several loose sheets of paper, a child's drawing partially obscured by a layer of dust, and a solitary, nearly empty packet of dried food hinted at the long-forgotten life that had passed through here. Heart-pounding, Jake reached for the notebook. Its cover was worn, the embossed letters almost erased by time, yet he could still make out the faint impression of his mother's handwriting in a flourish along the spine. Sitting down on a threadbare seat, he slowly opened the notebook. The pages crackled softly, and he began to read entries written in neat, deliberate script. Each page was filled with conflicting emotions. Notes of hope and regret, desperate attempts to forge a new future, and the heavy burden of secrets kept in the silence of a troubled heart. The entries were confessions, Maya's intimate recollections laid bare in mournful candor. She wrote of a life not merely defined by wanderlust, but by harrowing escape. Each carefully penned line revealed that the camping trip was not simply a peaceful departure into nature. It was a final attempt to flee a fate too terrible to endure. In her honest words, Maya revealed the unbearable truth. She had been a victim of domestic violence at the hands of the man who, until then, had been regarded by the family as a caring figure. The notebook detailed how the abuse had scarred her very soul, how it had pushed her to make an impossible choice, to vanish with Kelsey in order to offer her daughter a chance at a life free from suffering. She expressed her guilt and sorrow at leaving behind memories, and her desperate hope to someday find safety and redemption for both of them. even as she carried the burden of leaving a part of herself behind. Jake's eyes skimmed each line with a mix of anguish and revelation. He felt as though a veil was being slowly lifted from his entire past. The familiar narrative he had grown up with, the blame he had carried since childhood, all were now being challenged by the raw, unfiltered truth of his mother's voice. The notebook narrated the planning of her escape, the careful measures she had taken to hide away her tracks, and the secret rendezvous points she had arranged in the hope of someday being reunited with a future free from terror. In one entry, Maya pleaded not to be found, fearing the consequences of being discovered by the man who had inflicted so much pain. In another, she described the symbolic act of leaving behind personal mementos as a way to sever the ties to her past, mementos that had, poignantly, included an old, rusted truck and her daughter's cherished drawings. Between the pages, interspersed with heartfelt prose and scribbled doodles of a child's world, were remnants of food, a small, crinkled wrapper and dried fragments of sustenance that painted a picture of a life lived on the edge, both literally and figuratively. Every item served as a testament to the desperate measures taken when survival meant sacrificing much more than pride. It was in these quiet, sorrowful moments, in that long-forgotten truck enveloped by shifting sands, that the true confession of Maya's life emerged as a beacon of truth. Outside, the desert wind continued its ceaseless song, scattering sand over the abandoned relic as if trying to efface its scars. Inside, Jake felt an overwhelming mixture of grief, anger, and a fierce, burning need for clarity. The discovery of the notebook was more than just evidence. It was a confession that turned the very foundations of his understanding upside down. He realized that the narrative he had been forced to live with, of a disappearance spurred by mysterious circumstances, was, at its core, a tale of desperate escape, hidden violence, and a mother's unyielding determination to protect her child at any cost. Clutching the notebook close to his heart, Jake knew there was no going back. The letter and the drawing had led him here, to this forsaken truck amid the boundless desert, where his search for truth had finally borne bitter fruit. The notebook, with its weathered pages and raw honesty, was the bridge to the past, and any future he hoped to build would depend on the courage to face the revelations it now contained. Inside the battered truck, beneath the relentless beating of the Arizona sun and the quiet whispers of a wind that knows too many secrets, Jake turned his full attention back to the leather-bound notebook. Its time-worn pages crackled beneath his fingertips as if each crease bore the sorrow and urgency of a mother's hidden confession. Here, in the faded ink and delicate script of Maya Miller, lay the truth that had eluded him for over a decade. A truth that rewrote everything he had believed about that final camping trip and the mysterious disappearance of his mother and little sister. The opening entry, dated on that fateful weekend, immediately set a tone that was both tender and terrified. Maya wrote of the shimmering hope that had filled her heart when she first planned the camping getaway. She had longed for a peaceful escape, a temporary respite from the relentless pressures of city life and the muted turmoil at home. But as she detailed in simple, desperate words, the desert had not granted her the freedom she sought. Instead, it had become an accomplice in horrors that were very real. As the cool ink flowed across each page, Maya revealed her mounting dread of the man she once trusted. Her husband, Jake's father, a man whose charming exterior concealed a vicious temperament that had slowly eroded the sanctuary of their family. In a quiet paragraph heavy with regret, she recounted the relentless episodes of abuse. Her words rendered stark images of nights filled with cold, suffocating fear, of whispered apologies to herself as she bandaged her bruised arms in secret, and of the hollow, echoing silence that followed every bout of violence. Every scar on my body, every tear in my heart, reminds me that I once believed in love, she had written, her handwriting trembling with the weight of betrayal. Maya documented how the abuse had crept into every corner of her life, even the simple act of camping, which had become laced with foreboding. Like a scribe of survival, she left a trail of evidentiary notes, dates, times, even ink-stained reminders of the bruises that the world was never meant to see. One particularly harrowing entry described that last night with a shattering clarity. Maya wrote about the moment when, beneath a sky dotted with indifferent stars, She realized she could no longer live in a home where terror lurked in every whispered word and clenched fist. With her daughter Kelsey asleep only a few feet away, Maya's heart shattered as she resolved to abandon her old life, even if it meant vanishing without a trace. "I must protect my child," she pleaded in the margins, the letters almost bleeding with desperation. "If I do not leave, our lives will drown in his cruelty." In that painful moment, every promise of a better tomorrow was eclipsed by the necessity of escape. She planned meticulously, erasing digital footprints, leaving behind only ambiguous clues for anyone who might one day search. A secret itinerary concealed between lines of poetic regret and calculated hope. Scattered among the confessions were small, poignant doodles, childlike sketches that Maya had drawn on the blank spaces between her written words. One such drawing, rendered in trembling handwriting, depicted a fragile flower emerging from a dark crack in the desert floor, symbolizing both loss and the possibility of new growth. Another, more striking image showed a frightened little girl clutching a teddy bear, her eyes wide with terror yet glistening with an unspoken plea for rescue. These images, innocent yet laden with meaning, lent the entries a dual nature. The raw pain of a victim and the fierce, protective love of a mother desperate to shield her daughter from a future marred by violence. As Jake turned the pages, he discovered a crucial detail that forced him to reconsider everything he had known. In one entry dated just hours before their disappearance, Maya wrote a narrow, cryptic message. "The desert will keep our secret safe, but the truth must be found by the one who bears our name. I flee, not from the wilderness, but from him. May my silence light your path." The words resonated with a dual message, a farewell and a call to truth. They hinted that fleeing was not an act of cowardice but a desperate bid for survival, a necessary step to protect Kelsey from the violent shadows cast by her father. Her plea carried the weight of both guilt and liberation, as if her escape was the only way to etch a future free from suffering for the one child she hoped would one day understand the painful legacy of their family. In another tear-stained passage, Maya detailed the grim efforts she had taken to mislead the investigation. She wrote of how she had falsified hints of a joyous, voluntary departure, using her love for nature as camouflage for the darker truth of her flight from abuse. It became apparent in her words that the official inquiry had been manipulated. Her husband, desperate to salvage his image and avoid accountability, had interfered with the searches, ensuring that the only traces were those she meticulously concealed herself. It was a calculated cover-up, a dark, unspoken conspiracy to erase her existence from the narrative of their lives. The confessions in the notebook, unvarnished and devastating, painted a picture of a woman who had been forced to choose between silence and survival, between protecting a life and shattering the illusion of family unity. Reading through Maya's final entries, Jake could scarcely breathe. Every page was a testament to the sacrifices she had made in silence. Every word an echo of a truth that he had long buried beneath layers of guilt and grief. The revelations were not merely about a disappearance. They were the unflinching confessions of a woman who had borne the unbearable cost of love, one that demanded she forsake everything to save the innocence of her child. For the first time, Jake saw the hidden narrative of his childhood, one in which his mother had been both a victim and a hero, whose disappearance was an act of defiant love aimed at protecting the fragile hope that lived within Kelsey. Standing amidst swirling memories and desert heat filtering through the cracked window of the truck's cab, Jake clutched the notebook close to his heart. The pages, imbued with Maya's courage and sorrow, beckoned him toward answers he had spent years searching for. They promised to redefine his past and shape the future. If only he could accept the truth that his mother had fought so hard to inscribe on these fragile sheets of paper. With the confessions of Maya laid bare within the notebook and the rusted truck standing as a silent testament to a long-forgotten past, Jake began piecing together a new, darker narrative, one that challenged everything the family had once believed. The official reports had long painted the disappearance of Maya and Kelsey as either an unsolvable mystery or the desperate flight of two souls seeking a new beginning in the vast wilderness. Yet the raw, intimate words of Maya's own diary hinted at a more sinister conspiracy, a deliberate act designed to hide abuse and protect a beloved perpetrator. Determined to uncover the full truth, Jake delved into the dusty archives of local law enforcement and public records, a journey that would eventually lead him to a revelation that shattered all prior certainties. Late one sleepless night, after countless hours pored over faded police case files and old media reports, Jake discovered discrepancies that set his heart pounding. The initial investigation had been hasty and, as it appeared, tainted by external influences. In the archived interview transcripts with search and rescue volunteers, several contradictory details began to emerge. One unsettling conversation described how, on the morning after the camping trip, local volunteers had recalled an eerie conversation over a handheld radio where a voice, identified only as Miller, uttered cryptic warnings to keep things quiet. To most, it was a mere offhand remark, a reflection of the tension permeating the case. But in light of the journal entries, it became clear that these were not nonsensical mutterings. They were cautious instructions meant to deflect attention from a deliberate cover-up. Jake's investigation led him to contact a retired sergeant from the local police department, a man who had once approached the case with passion and integrity. Over numerous conversations in his cramped, memory-draped office, the retired officer revealed that he had long harbored doubts about the swift closure of the case. Behind the public narrative, whispers had circulated that someone with deep personal ties to the Miller family had exerted a disturbing influence on the investigation, misdirecting resources, and even tampering with evidence. Together, they uncovered traces of internal memos and emails buried deep in archival records that detailed unusual police directives and unexplained delays in forensic tests. One memo, in particular, mentioned that sensitive family dynamics must be handled discreetly to protect the family's reputation. The language was vague, yet painfully suggestive. Piece by piece, Jake assembled a dossier that painted an unmistakable picture. His father, John Miller, had been intimately involved in manipulating the investigation. Fearing exposure of his abusive behavior and desperate to maintain the illusion of a stable family, John had used his influence to steer the inquiry away from his own dark secrets. The documents showed that after the camping trip, John had been seen making inexplicable phone calls to local officials, urging them to refrain from pursuing certain leads. In a particularly damning email extracted from a police archive, a sergeant's terse note read, "Ensure we do not push too far into Miller's personal affairs. It might complicate internal reviews." The message was chilling in its implication. Rather than protect the missing mother and daughter, John had sought to bury the truth, protecting himself from the consequences of his abusive actions that had forced Maya into a desperate escape. As Jake meticulously cross-referenced his mother's intimate diary entries with these newly discovered confidential documents, a tragic tapestry unfolded before him. Each disjointed piece of evidence aligned with Maya's narrative. The quietly recorded details of abusive episodes, her urgent declarations in the margins of her journal, and the circumstantial evidence of a cover-up orchestrated by a man whose public face belied a dangerous cruelty. It was not a mysterious desert predator or a random act of fate that had snatched Maya and Kelsey away. It was the calculated betrayal of someone who had once been their protector. The guilt, Jake realized, did not reside with the missing alone. The true wrong rested with the man who had manipulated everything behind the scenes. In a surge of anger and sorrow, Jake confronted the painful memories of his childhood, the paralyzing guilt he had borne for years, the accusations from peers who blamed him for not being able to avert the tragedy. Now, as the evidence mounted, he understood that the blame was never his. Instead, his father's desperate, misguided attempts to hide his own shame had rewritten the narrative of their family's past. The prospect of officially reopening the case now seemed not only justified but imperative. With renewed determination, Jake reached out to investigative journalists and sympathetic members of the law enforcement community who still believed that the truth deserved to be heard, no matter how deeply it was buried. Late into one cold desert night, amid the brittle glow of a single lamp in his cluttered study, Jake recorded his findings in a detailed report. Every document, every shadowy email, every faded transcript was filed meticulously, a trove of truth that could no longer be concealed. As he scanned the contents of the dossier one last time, the shock of his discovery mingled with a bittersweet sense of vindication. Inside this ream of evidence lay the key to absolving him of long-held guilt and, perhaps even more importantly, the hope of delivering lasting justice for Maya and Kelsey. The revelations were explosive. They meant that the saga of the Miller family was far from being a simple case of a mother and child lost in the endless desert. They had been sacrificed on the altar of one man's hidden savagery. With the evidence in hand, Jake felt both a heavy sorrow at the cost of what was lost and a fierce resolve to correct the historic record. The reopening of the investigation would unsettle many, but for Jake, it was the necessary step toward healing. A way to honor his mother's sacrifices by breaking the silence that had protected a murderer for far too long. At last, with countless secrets unearthed and painful truths chronicled, Jake Miller felt it was time to return to the heart of the desert, both to lay his family's ghosts to rest and to forge a path for healing. In the wake of a long, turbulent journey through dusty archives, stormy memories, and the harsh, unyielding sands of Arizona, he knew that true closure would only come when he could finally honor the sacrifice of his mother, Maya, and offer some measure of peace to the wounded legacy of their family. Under a scarlet sunset that blazed across the endless dunes like an elegy in fire, Jake drove his battered four-wheel drive back to the site where, 11 years before, the truck had emerged quietly from the sands. The memory of that moment, the surreal discovery of the rusted vehicle, the silent revelation of a handwritten notebook containing his mother's confessions, and the raw, unfiltered pain of a life marred by abuse, had both tormented and defined him. Now, the desert, long a keeper of secrets, seemed to whisper a promise of absolution. When he finally reached the spot, the truck stood exactly as he had first found it, half swallowed by the shifting dunes. Nearby, an ancient stone, worn smooth by time and wind, jutted out from the sand like a monument to forgotten stories. Here, Jake resolved to hide the notebook once more, a symbolic act that would represent both a farewell and a safeguard. Gently, he unlatched his duffel bag and pulled from it the frayed, leather-bound diary that had laid bare his mother's sorrow and her desperate bid for escape. Slowly and deliberately, he pressed the precious book into a narrow crevice beside the stone, ensuring it was secure and hidden from the prying eyes of the world. "May the desert keep your truth safe, Mom," he whispered into the stillness, as if speaking directly to the woman whose love had been both a salve and a source of unbearable pain. With the notebook now consigned to the silent vault of the dunes, Jake felt the weight of years of relentless pursuit and internal guilt begin to ease. But the journey was far from over. He knew that forgiveness, both for his mother's decisions and for the years of anguish he had endured, required ritual and remembrance. So he made his way to the small, weather-beaten memorial site he had arranged many years ago. Though Maya's body had never been recovered, a modest stone bearing her name had been interred in an unmarked grave near a quiet cemetery on the edge of town, a place where the memories of the lost often gathered in mythical solitude. Standing before the gravestone on an overcast morning, Jake allowed himself a moment of vulnerable reflection. The stone, worn smooth by the passing of countless seasons, bore the inscription "Maya Miller, beloved mother," whose love endured beyond shadows. In that silent space, he knelt and whispered apologies for the years of misunderstanding and self-blame he had carried, for believing that he was somehow responsible for her vanishing. As he traced the faint lines of the inscription with trembling fingers, he recalled the gentle strength in her words, the fierce tenderness that had driven her to flee the oppressive nightmare of abuse. The true weight of her sacrifice, and the truth hidden in her diary, washed over him, and for the first time, Jake realized that forgiveness was not a concession to pain, but a reclaiming of love that had once been stifled by silence. Resolute in his newfound clarity, Jake emerged from the cemetery with a vision to transform his pain into transformative purpose. In the months that followed, he dedicated himself to building a foundation aimed at helping victims of domestic violence and the desperate children forced to flee abusive households. The foundation, named Desert Hope, would serve as both a memorial to his mother's battle and a sanctuary for those caught in the grip of violence. Through community outreach, counseling services, and advocacy programs, Desert Hope sought not only to provide material assistance but also to give survivors a voice, so that their own stories could break the cycle of silence and reclaim the right to heal. Working with local support groups, volunteer counselors, and compassionate legal advocates, Jake slowly transformed the shattered fragments of his past into a beacon for others. The foundation hosted monthly gatherings where survivors of abuse could share their journeys, creating a network of empathy and understanding that spanned across towns far beyond the desert's reach. Through these efforts, Jake learned that healing was a collective process, a tapestry woven from individual threads of courage, forgiveness, and the unyielding human capacity to love, even in the face of unspeakable suffering. In a quiet ceremony at the Foundation's inaugural event, Jake recounted the harrowing tale of his family's disappearance, the burden of guilt that had haunted him for over a decade, and the unexpected discovery in the arid solitude of the desert. His testimony was raw and unfiltered, a tribute to a mother whose final act had been a desperate, yet brave, bid to protect her daughter, and a call for justice and compassion in the face of institutional silence. As he spoke, the audience listened with rapt attention, moved by the depth of his conviction and the clarity of his transformation. Here was a man who had emerged from the depths of personal betrayal and loss, determined not to allow his story, or the stories of countless others, to be erased by time and neglect. Later, as dusk descended once more over the desert, Jake returned to the place where it had all begun. Under the vast, star-strewn sky, he stood before the ancient stone, this time, not as a seeker of lost truths, but as a guardian of memory and a herald of forgiveness. In the whisper of the desert wind, he could almost hear his mother's soft lullabies and the echoes of her love. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool embrace of the night, and vowed that no matter how far one might run from the city, from people or even from time itself, the truth remains inescapable, a force that ultimately guides us home. Subscribe if you believe that you can run from the city, from people, even from time, but not from the truth. Even after 11 years, love still has the power to lead us back home.